We are now taking up the adolescence, body and mind. You'll find that in chapter 9 in your textbook. And so, just what age group is adolescence? We'd say, well, starts at puberty. We'll discuss when that occurs. And upper limits are not well defined, but we might say somewhere around 19, age 18, 19 is kind of being the transition to something that we call emerging adulthood that we'll study later. Puberty then is a process that begins, as the textbook says, from first onrush of hormones that result in full adult physical development. That process usually takes 3 to 5 years. When complete, the person has a full adult physical appearance. However, it takes many more years for that adolescent to mature psychologically and socially, even though they physically are an adult. So the process then begins with an increase of hormones along a couple of axes. The HPA axis represents the hypothalamus of the brain, signal the pituitary gland below it to stimulate the adrenal glands. Normally, this is involved with the release of stress hormones like epinephrine or epinephrine, we call adrenaline, as well as stress hormones like cortisol. The adrenals also produce small quantities of androgens, sexual hormones as well. Abnormalities in the functioning of this axis may contribute to severe ADHD, eating disorders, anxiety, and depression. As there's increased activity along this axis as puberty occurs, problems caused by malfunctioning of this may appear or worsen at puberty. More obvious is increased action along the HPG axis. This involves now the gonads, the sexual glands. So the gonads being the ovaries in females, the testicles in males. Release of gonadotrophin releasing hormone by the pituitary then stimulate the release of estradiol in girls, testosterone in boys. Estradiol is the chief estrogen hormone, more predominant in females, rising to 8 times the level of pre-adolescence. Testosterone, far more prevalent in males, reaching levels as much as 20 times what it was before adolescence in males. So these hormones affect not only physical development, but also emotions and behavior. So we will see in adolescence emotional changes as well as sexual urges becoming more prevalent. In boys, in particularly, due to higher rising levels of testosterone, this may stimulate various sexual urges. Bursts of hormones being released then may contribute to emotional extremes that some adolescents experience, maybe moving from excitement to despair, hopefully back to excitement in many cases. In girls, then, fluctuating levels of estrogens also associated with the menstrual cycle may result in changes in emotional state as that occurs. In addition to these having direct influence on emotional responses, as physical responses become obvious to others, physical maturity, other people's responses to that physical maturity may trigger emotional responses. For example, in boys, as they look more like men, more may be expected of them. And that adolescent that was just a child boy a few months ago may find that more demands are being placed on them as an adult. with girls as they become more physically mature due to the activities of these hormones. They may experience uh, responses to that. For example, a girl passing a construction site where construction workers might be making comments or whistling at them might find that experience to be frightening, might find it to be exciting, might find it to be annoying. Nonetheless, might trigger significant emotional reaction. There are also changes in bodily rhythms that are typical as adolescents go through puberty. Changes to circadian rhythm. This is our body's cycles that follow roughly a 24-hour cycle. We will see alterations in those biorhythms, one of these being phase delay. So the adolescent finds that they are no longer sleepy in the evening early, but rather feel like staying up late. And then, of course, also they would have difficulty getting up in the morning when they used to as a child, and would then sleep late if possible. So these alterations in sleep rhythms then may lead to sleep deprivation for a number of reasons. So for one reason, irregular weekly sleep patterns. So the adolescent then finding themselves not sleepy in the evening, stays up late, and then has difficulty getting up, gets up because they have to go to school on weekdays, and then again stays up late and doesn't get very much sleep during the week. Then comes the weekend and opportunity to stay up late. So they do stay up late, but then that exacerbates the problem of getting to sleep at night. So Saturday and Sunday, sleeping in late, comes Sunday night, time to get to bed and go to sleep. They're not sleepy, and even less so since they got up much later. Then the whole cycle starts again the next school week. So, results of this include daytime sleepiness, increased nightmares, difficulty learning, difficulty remembering, mood disorders, emotional responses like increased irritability, and more difficulty controlling one's behavior. So, in part, this is biological. In part, this also is a mismatch between the teenagers' natural bodily rhythm and school schedules. Adults have placed an expectation on them that may not be consistent with how their body operates. Some school districts, in fact, have incorporated starting school later for adolescents, maybe an hour or two. Interestingly, in those schools where they did that, they found these high schools, there were fewer behavioral problems, and adolescents did better on the standardized tests and in their academics. So it seems that we're better to work with nature than work against it. Having said all of this, I'm going to say that to some extent, these problems also are a matter of one's environment. And the fact that we also now have social media and TV screens and electrical lighting makes it all the more difficult to get to sleep at a normal time. So the problem is not only biological, but also aggravated by those factors. Obviously, if we can help adolescents to shut down the screens and put down social media early in the evening, dim the lights, and relax, they may be able to get to sleep somewhat earlier than they would otherwise. So, just when does puberty start? This is variable from one person to another. Anywhere between age 8 to 14 clinically is considered within the normal range. Before 8, precocious puberty occurs in 1 out of 5,000 children. cause being uncertain. So just what then determines exactly when puberty begins? Uh, First of all, genetic factors. And most strikingly would be genetic factors as to whether one is male or female. They find that girls are about 2 years ahead of boys in terms of the height spurt that one gets. And so if you drive past any middle school, you'll see often girls at that point in time being taller than the boys of the same age. Later on, the boys getting their height spurt catch up and surpass them in height. In terms of the hormonal changes of puberty, they find boys this occurring about 6 months later than girls on average. There are also family trends that seem to indicate genetic influence here. They find twins as identical twins and mothers and daughters, great correspondence in terms of when they begin puberty. Average age also varies by ethnicity. Now, there's little ethnic difference at the extremes, but average age varies. Have a look at this slide. It's coming up next. You can see here that average age of menarche, which would be the first period of girls. Average age, you find that those of European American background somewhere in the middle. African American girls on average age 12, European Americans age 12 and a half on average, and then Mexican Americans closer to age 13, Asians even a bit later than that. So some ethnic difference. On the other hand, at the extremes, you see that the extreme early, extreme late in, pretty much the same regardless of ethnicity. What else influences whether at the time at which puberty begins? Body fat levels. Individuals carrying more body fat tend to begin puberty earlier. That shows up in urban-rural patterns. Rural kids tending to carry a bit less body fat than kids who grew up in urban environments tended to enter puberty somewhat later than kids that grew up in an urban environment. Chronic malnutrition delays puberty as well. The body simply delaying puberty so that it can focus on survival. Another influence seems to be just general size, and this is reflected in what they call the secular trend. Over the past 200 years in developed nations, they find people maturing earlier and growing to a larger size, probably due to improved nutrition, medical advances like immunizations that prevent various diseases in childhood. So they think, though, that this is pretty much peak and that puberty in general is as early as it's going to become. People are growing to probably as great a height as they will. That said, in non-developed parts of the world, that may be still changing. We also know that stress alters the onset of puberty. It alters the release of cortisol, stress hormones, resulting in puberty coming earlier. So it hastens the onset of puberty. In one particular study, they found that girls who had been sexually abused entered puberty on average 7 months earlier than girls who did not experience sexual abuse. So the stress of that abuse actually influenced their physical response in terms of puberty. They also found in other studies that adolescents who were stressed due to parental sickness, becoming addicted to a drug, parents divorcing, or parents who used harsh treatment, with them tended to enter puberty earlier as well. In addition, onset of puberty in violent and impoverished neighborhoods is earlier than in neighborhoods where there's less of those kinds of problems. Now, that said, we have the influence of differential sensitivity shown here again, that some people are more susceptible to the effects of stress than others. The effect being more pronounced in girls, for example, that had a difficult infant temperament that cried a lot as babies, as opposed to those who had a more relaxed temperament, those not as much affected by stress in terms of puberty. Now, in times past, entering puberty, reaching full adult physical development was a benefit in times past. What we're going to see is today, early puberty seems no longer to benefit people in developed nations. So, what are the effects of maturing before or after one's peer? You might say too early or too late. We're going to find that either way, this presents difficulty to the adolescent. Early maturing girls, they found, tended to have a lower self-esteem, tended to develop depression problems more often, had a poorer body image on average, and were more at risk for developing boyfriends several years older than themselves, which exposed them to a number of hazards. They also tended to be isolated from their peers. If you can imagine the girl who begins going through puberty and showing physical changes as a result in, say, fourth grade or even early in fifth grade, before any of their peers are showing this, their peers simply don't seem to know how to handle that and may, in fact, sort of not interact with them so much. Also, early maturing girls tended to associate with older adolescents and therefore were exposed to temptations to experiment with drugs, alcohol, early sexual behavior. Early maturing girls also were more prone to end up with abusive partners even later on. Now, what about early maturing boys? That used to be an advantage. Those boys who matured early looked like men rather than children, were often the ones who became leaders in their class or were the ones who excelled in sports because they were bigger and stronger than the other boys at that point. Today, however, even though some of those things might still apply, if you're in an area where there is a good bit of adolescent law breaking, those early matured boys often are targeted by older law breaking boys. They like to bring them into their activities, knowing that they're not as psychologically mature. They may try to recruit them and get them to do various things that they want. So, in that case, not so much an advantage. Late maturing boys, yeah, some of you probably remember from high school boys who didn't go through puberty when the other boys did, often are ridiculed, bullied, taken advantage of by other kids. And so they often have a difficult time of it. That said, they saw some ethnic differences as they looked at this. For example, Chinese American boys who tended to mature later than other kids seem to kind of cope with it somewhat better. Maybe that's because in their culture, academic success is highly valued, and they were able to excel in these areas and produce what their culture was demanding of them. And so, even though they might experience some ridicule, they might cope with it more readily, having the other success. In both genders, they found that early maturity correlates with becoming involved in early romantic relationships, sexual activity, and even earlier parenthood, and experiencing higher rates of depression. So all in all, maturing out of step with one's peers can be very difficult for kids. Kids who do experience these extremes are going to really benefit from the support of others, support of adults, friends, and family. So, what are the transformations of puberty? Well, one is physically becoming bigger and stronger. So there's the growth spurt, a time of rapid and uneven physical growth where each body part increases in size. Usually there is a weight increase before the height increase. The limbs precede the torso in development as well. In other words, arms and legs lengthen, whereas the mid part of the body, the torso, doesn't. So what you have is a time period where that adolescent, the arms and legs seem to be long and spindly as compared to the rest of the body. This may present some difficulties with coordination, and so you have the adolescent who tends to be a little bit more clumsy for a time until their torso catches up with the growth of the limbs. Other bodily changes that occur in puberty include organs growing larger and becoming more efficient. So the lungs triple in weight, the heart doubles in size, and therefore can beat more slowly as it can pump more blood with each stroke. Blood volume increases. And the immune system then is fine tuned. That means that children that had allergies, asthma, and things like that may find that these now go away. You might say they outgrow them. Overall, these bodily changes also allow the adolescent to do more physical work, more physical performance, have more endurance, more strength. That said, the weight and height increase before the increases in muscle strength, bone density, and the development with the internal organs. So, what this means is you may have adolescents that look pretty big and strong, yet these things have not yet occurred, the muscle strength, bone density, and internal development. So, that means that they're not fully ready, even though the body looks larger and more mature. That has some implications for athletic training. So after boys or girls begin showing these physical height and size changes, they may look like they're ready for more intense training, but in fact, they may need a few more months. So the rest of the development catches up before they're put into more intense programs. If coaches try to do this too early, that adolescent is at risk for injuries that would not occur if they had waited just a few more months. In terms of sexual maturation, we have the development of the primary sexual characteristics. These are the body parts directly involved in reproduction, the penis, vagina, and so forth. These reach their full maturity. You also have the development of secondary sexual characteristics. These are things that are not directly related to reproduction, but rather give an indication of the person's sex. For example, you have the growth of facial hair and the growth of greater muscle structure on boys. And with girls, you have the development of breasts and so on. So these secondary sexual characteristics tend to be greater in their psychological effect than the changes in the primary sexual characteristics. These are the things that people can readily see about the person that are different and affect how others respond to them. So that brings you to the end of this portion of the chapter. As you can see here, you can now go on and pick up the remainder of the chapter using the link provided you here, or you can look for it. I'll be sending out a separate link for that in case you don't have it there. So we'll leave it at that. And that's it.